E te ahorangi, tēnā koe. I rangatira mā, I rau akonga mā, tēnā koutou. Ko Aoraki te maunga, ko Waimakariri te awa, ko Charlotte Jane te waka, ko Logan tōku iwi, no Alto tahi ahau, ko Jamie Rowa, ko Sally o ko Matua, ko Devon Polaschek tōku ingoa. Kei kirikiri roa, tōku kāinga naenei, kei te mahio I te whare wānanga o Waikato. Koutou katoa kua tai mai nei I tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā hui tātou katoa. So as I said, I'm Devon Polaschek, and I think the rest of what you need to know about me you can see in the program. I just want to thank the conference organisers for this opportunity. As you may know, Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato was a founding partner of the New Zealand Evidence-Based Policing Centre, so it's especially meaningful for me to have this opportunity. And I'd especially like to thank Superintendent Cowan, who I heard this morning saying that I have one of these fortunate long-winded slots in the program. So actually I know that after 5 minutes or so, no police will be listening to me, according to Superintendent Cowan. Thank you for that. I'll just be left with my small fan base who already probably know what I'm going to say. What I am going to talk about, though, is, broadly speaking, what is offender management, what is integrated offender management, and how do police around the world, insofar as we can tell, engage with it, and should they engage with it, particularly in the role of a case manager? Does it work? And finally, tying it back to the theme of the conference, does being involved in it increase police legitimacy? So I'm giving this talk in my capacity as what I hope is a critical friend of police. And I want to note and commend the New Zealand Police for its strong prevention first approach, which is certainly compatible with ideas about how to do offender management better. And I think we've already learned today about the forward-thinking ideas of the current Police Commissioner, who has reaffirmed the importance of policing by consent and is committed to the view that the use of the environment, of enforcement rather, is ideally a last resort. So what I'm doing in this talk really is trying to integrate what's known about effectively managing people with high and complex needs and offending history, and it draws on my long association with Arapautama Aotearoa, New Zealand Corrections, and with correctional research literature around the world. And I'm also relying quite heavily on the UK, which is probably the place that has best documented the official adoption of the Integrated Offender Management Framework, and to a lesser extent, a number of other jurisdictions. I'm using the term offender all the way through this talk with some trepidation because I do prefer to use person-first language, and because even the most prolific and high-risk offenders are often people who spend most of their time actually living their lives pretty much the way that you and I do. So with those opening remarks, I just want to start by noting that Arapautama Aotearoa, New Zealand Department of Corrections, actually adopted integrated offender management in 2001. And the idea there was to recognise that to better support people in making changes that might reduce their risk and enable them to live better lives, we wanted to ensure that people's sentence was managed in an end-to-end way in order to provide them with the best opportunities for that change. So formal induction with a bespoke assessment plan and then sentence plan and then reintegration. It involved changes in the roles of key personnel as well. Prison officers were encouraged towards active management, where they didn't just see themselves as custodial monitors, if you like, but as people who could interact meaningfully and positively with the people in their care. And probation officers were also moved from simply doing their traditional social work role to acute risk management as well, so picking up when things were going wrong for people and offering immediate support that could help them avoid an offence. So the idea behind this is that all staff would collaborate and focus on each person in the sentence. And for correctional services, the effective rehabilitation and reintegration of people in their care or offenders can be a way to save quite a lot of money as well as achieving social good. And I thank Annalisa Johnston, who did a very good report for Salvation Army, for this comment from a participant in their research and also the comment that goes with it. It's a very good argument. It's now well over $100,000 to keep someone in prison for a year. And so a lot of money can be saved if we're more effective about keeping people out. Now, of course, before the formal adoption of IOM as a cross-agency approach, the UK and indeed New Zealand had and does have a number of these active cross-agency collaborations. To give some examples, in the UK, we've got MAPA, the Prolific and Other Priority Offenders Program, the Drug Intervention program and youth offending teams and so on in New Zealand. Current examples would be the integrated safety response to family violence and the child sex offender register. And if we're talking about the integrated safety response to family violence, it was done in recognition that the family violence system, trying to access it, looks something like this, according to the excellent work done by Ruth Herbert and colleagues in 2014 for the Backbone Collective. So very difficult system, very hard to find your way in, and if you do, it doesn't join up with anything else. And the integrated family safety response to family violence was seen as a way to do a much better job of helping people experience a joined-up service, regardless of which door they went through. And so you can see here that there's an end-to-end service for people that brings in all these government departments. So an integrated offender management system is a cross-agency response that improves the quality of life of communities, ideally by reducing the negative impact of crime and offending, reducing victims, and helping to improve public confidence. And if we look at how it developed in the UK, where it was introduced in the early noughties, we can see that the targets have varied. So while it started off with prolific offenders, there was a movement towards high-risk offenders, and in some cases, in some communities, different areas of the offending population. And also some difference in who's in the partnership. So typically police and probation, but also various others, such as people providing drug and alcohol services, people providing housing services, employment services, national health system, education, and so on. I hope you can hear me. We're in the middle of some extremely heavy rain, and I find I have to yell to be heard over the rain. Rather unusual. So these systems are different at every site, and that's one of the things that can make it very hard to work out whether they work or not. In the UK, ION was formally introduced in 2008, and then it was disrupted quite badly in 2014 by the then government movement towards what's called transforming rehabilitation, which was quite a destructive movement in terms of the effects on this new integrated offender management system, because it broke up community probation into a bunch of, I think, about 21 privatised companies who dealt with the low to medium risk offenders and created a payment by results focus. And actually it was reversed, I think, last year, this, because of how destructive it was. But as you can see, that meant that they actually proposed in this rather delightful Guardian article that people could report to an ATM type device if they were in the lower risk end of things, which makes you really wonder why they're on sentence at all, given that probation in New Zealand at least is seen as a sentence that's supportive and rehabilitative as well as punitive. So when we get back to the issue of how important relationships are to helping offenders desist, then this kind of system is really well off track in that respect. The overall approach was refreshed, as government things often are, in 2015 with a new added emphasis really on long-term desistance from crime, not just on short-term goals. Unfortunately, at the same time, there was a further tightening of the financial strictures, and a reliance on existing programs came to be central, which meant there really wasn't enough program service to go around. Integrated offender management is said to be loosely informed by the risk-need responsivity model, which is very familiar to people who work in corrections because it's the primary kind of umbrella under which effective services sit. And in the risk-need responsivity model, what you're doing firstly is targeting resources where they can have the most effect on public safety, and that is with people who are at most risk. So if we can alter the trajectories of people who are at the most risk of offending, then we can have the best impact on them and the people around them and generally on society. At the same time, we need to put quite a lot of service into those people. They're not going to respond easily to small amounts of input because they've usually accumulated a long history of adversity and problematic characteristics that keep it all going for them. And so the target is on changeable needs, which are often called criminogenic needs or dynamic risk factors. And the key thing, which often gets forgotten in these first three principles, is the importance of providing services that are responsive to what people can actually take up. So we try to meet people where they are. And by that, I mean, if they're not very motivated, then it's our job to motivate them. If they have learning disabilities or they can't get into our services except in the evening, we make sure we deal with those things and so on. There are actually 15 principles to this model, and many of the others are important as well, but I'll leave that for the moment. So does ION work? The first thing with any intervention like this is looking at whether what's being actually delivered or rolled out bears any resemblance to what was designed. And so in 2014, the first criminal justice joint inspection in the UK was done quite early on in the scheme, and they were cautiously optimistic about 6 different ION schemes, because remember, they're all regionally or city-based, so all different. But, and I've highlighted this, police officers had not been trained in the principles of rehabilitation, and yet they were expected to do it. And this is always a problem when there's inadequate training, especially when you're asking people to shift quite a lot from what they traditionally do. Service users reported the importance of credible case managers, regardless of whether they were police or probation officers. There was progress on risk factors in a good way for about a third to half of cases, which is quite impressive, but the reoffending results were described as poor. And then last year, they reported again on where things were at. And this was quite sad, really. So the kind of take-home message was that IOM has lost its way and has a much lower profile than previously. The problem really looked to be that the potential for the system to be effective wasn't really realised because probably of weak implementation, unresolved role confusion and weak interventions, and so a lack of resources. And if you deal with that, then something that could be effective won't be in practice. There's been a bit of research, though, not a lot, that has looked at whether or not it reduces reconviction risk, which is also one of the things that's quite important with ION. And the most rigorous of the interventions to date was done by Dawson and colleagues for the Diamond Initiative in London. It was a really well-designed recidivism study, but it found no effect on recidivism for those in the ION condition compared to those who were not over a 12-month follow-up. And there's a couple of other evaluations that also look tentatively positive, but they tend to have poorer designs. This is a chronic problem, of course, in the whole criminal justice area, is developing really good evaluations, particularly getting large enough sample sizes and working out the right answer to the compared to what question, what should the right comparison group be. So then, can police contribute to this new aim that was added to long-term assistance? I think in order to start thinking about, first off, we need to think about who are these high harm offenders that we think that police should be looking at, or that should be the central part, if you like, of these integrated offender management systems. So let's spend a little bit of time thinking about that. We know that there are several different common trajectories that are found for the life course of people involved in offending. Clearly, you can see in this one 4 trajectories. Depending on the study, you get 3 to 4. So you've got a group who are a little bit involved in adolescence, tail right off. There's a sort of low-level life course group. And then there's these 2 other groups who are most talked about, adolescence limited, which are people who actually do a lot of offending in adolescence, but came out of a relatively ordinary childhood into that, and then tail off relatively rapidly in early adulthood. And then the group that we're probably most interested in when we talk about high-risk, high-needs people, and that's this group that has sometimes been called the life course persistent people. Even those people do desist over time. So here we can see that these high-risk people are tailing off into their 50s, but it does take quite a while. We know quite a lot in New Zealand about this group from the work of the longitudinal project known as the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, or simply the Dunedin Study. It's known around the world. And it was practically an entire birth cohort from Dunedin Hospital in the period from 1972 to 73, about 1,000 people, slightly more boys. And this sample is interesting because it's primarily European and Pākehā. So that means what we know about this sample is kind of the best case scenario, given that for Māori and Pacifica, there are often extra layers of adversity and difficulty. So this is what happens in the course of development if you grew up in Dunedin, or at least during the 70s. These people have been interviewed at 2 to 3 year intervals and are now into they're close to 50. Now, it's the case that about 10% of them are life course persistent, and that fits very well with the knowledge around the world that a very, very small proportion of people, typically around 5 to 10%, are way overrepresented in both prolific offending and also in high harm offending. So what do we know about these people that might contribute to thinking about long-term persistence in high-risk, high-needs people? Well, according to Terry Moffat and colleagues, these adults that we're talking about can be identified by their behaviour as early as 3 years old, which is, I think, really quite shocking. It's not deterministic, but like any predictive system, there's error in it and people can prove you wrong, if you like. But a variable called lack of control at the age of 5 years is actually predictive of which of these young people will have convictions for violence at 18. And that's conviction for violence in a system that doesn't rush to convict teenagers. So as children, they're quite difficult, very young children. They're clumsy, they're irritable, they are often delayed in their milestones. They're quite difficult to parent. It's likely their adversity or risk factor profile starts to develop from conception, but it can also be caused by parental drug abuse or parental victimisation or malnourishment, birth difficulties and so on. So this is a child who is already challenging quite early in life. They absorb stress and react to it in an aggressive way. They're not persistent. They have quite a difficult temperament. And as they continue, they also tend to find that they're in situations of typical social and familial disadvantage, such as criminologists have often talked about. And the combination of all of this leads them to struggle at school and at home, to be aggressive, which leads to peer rejection, and then they're involved in child antisocial behaviour. They get into rule violation, they get expelled from school, they start to use alcohol and drugs and gravitate towards similar peers, and so it goes. By the time these young people in the Dunedin study were 18 years old, they were describing themselves as feeling mistreated and betrayed by others, and preferring danger and excitement, and perhaps most concerning, to be enjoying causing discomfort to others. So this is their own description of themselves, and I think it's important because it suggests that we as a society have already failed them, that already they feel that they've had a rough steer with life, and very likely the authority figures they've had, their parents and so on, have failed them. And that means they're already coming into adulthood probably unlikely to be particularly compliant with authority, because authority hasn't earned the respect that they had a right to demand of it. And it may well affect interactions with police. By the time they're 26 years old, they were highly involved in violence. So remember, they're about 10% of the sample, perpetuating 43% of the conviction-type violence, known to police violence. Self-reported violence, actually more over 50%. They've also got more kids than other people, so they're parents, and they are harmful to their families. They're more likely to hit a child in anger. And because of what's called assortative mating, where we don't choose our parents randomly, also more likely to have an antisocial partner, which can also add a degree of complexity to the management of them. This is just what I was saying, 43% of the violent convictions for this 10% for convictions, and it's 53% for this 10% when it's self-report. At the age of 32, and this is really where I was going with this rather long point, in addition to being involved extensively in crime, they also are now showing a number of other problems that we really should pause and think about. So it's easy, I think, to see people as mad or bad, or as bad and good, you know, all these simple dichotomies we have about the world. But this group is a high needs group, and it's starting to really show by the age of 32, if it didn't already show in childhood, which arguably it did. So they have by now more mental health problems than others. And these are not the mental health problems you typically think of, like antisocial personality disorder or drug and alcohol abuse. I mean, they are actually, but they're also PTSD, their anxiety and depression, their attempts at suicide. They're the kind of suffering that we all have when we have mental disorders. They're also starting to show up with some pretty concerning physical health issues, more smoking, poorer dental health, more cardiovascular risk factors, chronic bronchitis, serious injuries and so on. They've got major economic problems that make it difficult for them to look after themselves and their families. They're living in low household income, food scarcity, financial problems, homelessness, unemployment, and so on. And as I mentioned before, they have crime problems as well. So they're starting to look like a group who's going to need the help of more than just our criminal justice system if we're going to help to get them onto a more positive pathway. Now, I can recommend this movie to you if you haven't seen it. This is a New Zealand movie called Savage, came out, I think, last year. And it's really here to remind me to talk to you about other factors that we haven't even really touched on because they don't tend to have come up in the Dunedin study. So one of them is the effects of state care. And we're really getting a good picture now, if we didn't already have one, of how harmful state care has been for a big chunk of our population, in particular Māori and young Māori men. And the Savage movie is actually based centrally on the life of a Pākehā man who has, as you can see in this picture, Pōneke, which is one of the Māori names for Wellington, across his face. He's actually a Pākehā. But he grows up alongside a young Māori man in state care, and they band together to get involved in gangs as they get older, very much following the hypothesis I've heard discussed by Sir Kim Workman, the well-known New Zealand criminal justice reformer, that coming out of that situation and the vulnerability of that into a way to look after themselves, which very much involved forming together into bands of young men who were mutually dependent on each other. So what does desistance look like? Desistance is an interesting thing because it's a bit like smoking. In between cigarettes, you're not a smoker, and in between offences, you're not desisting. Excuse me a minute. And so people can be desisting without even really trying to. They just may have a gap in their offending history that makes it look like they've stopped, or they may be desisting out of deliberate intent, in which case sometimes what can happen is that they can come back into the criminal justice system when they were actually trying really hard. And it's important that we think about the complexities of that. So, as I said before, most people offend during adolescence. It's very normative to offend during adolescence, and most of it goes unnoticed. And if it does go unnoticed, then what can happen is that that person can quietly mature into the more attractive roles of adulthood, which by then are more appealing because they're not being a defined adolescent anymore, according to Terry Moffat. And so they can simply go on and resume their adult roles. But of course, some people get caught up in the criminal justice system at that stage, even if they wouldn't have otherwise. And so they go on to be highly involved. But that's not the normal pathway for people whose childhoods were relatively intact. The people we're talking about, though, these high-risk, high-harm offenders, tend to, as I said earlier, be coming from this very early pattern of adversity and problematic characteristics. And for them, it is much harder to leave the criminal justice system. So there are lots of reasons why this 10% or so of men on the life force persistent pathway can find it really difficult to get free. It can be very hard to re-establish oneself in the community. It's also worth saying that while these are people who arguably deserve our sympathy for the myriad harms they've had, we also have to be mindful of the harm that they cause. And this gives us this very complex emotional and intellectual algebra when we're thinking about how to manage them. What they're often trying to do, and they may decide to try desistance, years before they actually appear to be successful at it, and then may fail because it's just too hard. They don't have the kind of personal and support resources that they need. So if we don't put a lot into setting them up well, then they may not be able to pick up opportunities for things like employment that would in turn help them to make the long-term identity changes needed. So quite often it's a pretty zigzagging path between offending and not offending, between persistence and desistance, and it gets more feasible with practice. And so it's not uncommon to meet men in particular who were trying really hard. They're back in prison now. They might have to wait a few years before they get another chance to get back on the desistance pathway. As I said before, even then, most of those men will get off the treadmill at some point. So, what kind of human service skills do workers need to support desistance? And the key ones are actually to do with relationships and how you use relationships. So relationships are a source of interpersonal influence, and what we're trying to do when we're getting people to desist is to influence them, something that I'm sure police spend a lot of time thinking about. So interpersonal influence is most powerful when you're warm and enthusiastic, when you're collaborative in how you work with the person, when you make it a mutual kind of relationship, you're respectful, you show liking and interest, even when that person's not treating you well. Because with that bond that you can do something to develop, you can use it to structure the interaction. And by structuring the interaction, we now mean that the time that you spend with that person, however short it is, you can use, if you like, for good. So you can use it to model effective authority practices. You can give approval for things that you want. Disapproval should be used very sparingly. This is well known in the psychological literature, and any parent also knows that punishment has a very limited role. So you need to use far more reinforcement than punishment, far more praise than disapproval. And then you're also trying to teach skills, to be an advocate for the offender, to help connect them up to services that they may need. and using motivational interviewing skills and cognitive restructuring as needed and so on. So there's quite a lot to it, but the key part of it, as I say, is developing that bond and then using that bond for positive influence. When I talk about this, what I'm talking about is increasingly the use of the deployment of dual roles in our criminal justice system. So whereas, perhaps 20 years ago, a prison officer would just be in charge of counting heads and locking and unlocking doors. And I just think we heard Commissioner Costa talking about how different it was when he started and so on. Increasingly, we're trying to capitalise on the opportunities that people who are involved in some form of compliance role could also use that role more constructively to provide care and support as well. That makes their jobs pretty challenging. Why are we doing this? Well, a cynic might say it's cheaper. The National Offender Management Service in Britain, when they had a big cut in funding, decided to really push this every contact can be a therapeutic teaching moment sort of approach, if you like. But at the same time, people with compliance roles in our criminal justice system actually usually have the most contact with other people. It's not your psychologist who sees a few people in a year that's going to actually have the most influence. It's your probation officer and so on. That's the idea. So how far can we really push out the boat on these dual role relationships? How far can we get in using people to do two roles at once in an effective way? And surprisingly far is the answer. So this research I had the privilege to be involved in with my colleague Jen Scheme and two of her students a few years ago with mental health probation officers. They have a support role, but they're also trying to get people to comply with mandated mental health treatment and also other conditions of their supervision. And they found that increased compliance, that they would be less likely to breach their sentences and so on if the probation officers showed what were called fairness and caring, and decreased compliance was associated with toughness. Now, toughness is a kind of style which is authoritarian rather than authoritative. It isn't helpful. It's about letting people really find their own way, not showing any keenness towards them and treating them in a somewhat mistrustful and perhaps slightly bullying fashion. And we found in New Zealand too, using a cut-down version of this instrument, that it also helped to predict the nature of the probation officer's relationship with high-risk parolees on parole, was also predictive of outcomes. So here we were looking at both revocation and new convictions, and we found that at 2 months, these parolees' ratings of the probation officer's behaviour was predictive of re-imprisonment, and the probation officer ratings themselves were predictive of reconviction. And you might say, well, great, but here's the crunch really. We used an assessment of the level of risk using an actuarial tool to proxy for how difficult the offender they were working with was. So people who are high risk, they're high needs, they're complex needs, they're often quite difficult people to work with. And when they were working with high risk people, probation officers rated their relationship behaviour more poorly, which is kind of what you'd expect. But nevertheless, their behaviour still predicted these outcomes over and above that level of risk, which means that they were doing their job of trying to be a good behaving person, if you like, a person who treated the person well, despite how difficult the person was. So that's the argument of professionalism. And so when we think about the Pelian principle of the police being the people and the people being the police, actually that's not what we really want. We want people to be police, and for police to be people who can really behave better than the person they're interacting with, of course. So that got me to thinking about the attitude test and other sort of descriptions throughout the literature of police culture about police doing things like provoking arrests, either because they enjoy enforcing discipline or using their authority in a heavy-handed way, or because perhaps they believe the person should be in custody anyway. And so the attitude test from the perspective of what works for the systems is the reverse of what we need. So it's making professional behaviour contingent on the behaviour of the person being worked with. So here's Dave, who was an ION patrol officer, explaining that it's quite simple really. If someone's compliant and polite, they'll have a positive contact. If they're obstructive, violent or abusive, they're failing the test, which means that, well, you couldn't arrest them straight out. You could go looking for something that would enable you to do so. Now, police officers can use their role in a good way, even when they're in these difficult dual roles, such as they might find themselves in an integrated offender management program if they are in the case manager role. So here we have a police case manager saying, personally, I don't think it's right for me to be arresting them. The people I'm dealing with, there are circumstances, and I tell my offenders, I don't want to arrest you, but if you do something stupid in front of me, then I will have to arrest you. I'm a police officer, but that's not what I want. It's not how I want to deal with them. I don't want them to see me as a threat if I go around and knock on the door. I want them to answer the door and invite me in. So this is someone who's really trying to use his or her role in a professionally mature kind of way. And it's often, in fact, the way that we do see mature prison officers and probation officers and police officers behaving. They know they've got a stick that they can use, but they try to get the consent of the offender to help them not to have to use it. It can be done, but it's not easy. And that really brought me to the question of whether police should be case managers of IOM high priority people. So police could be very effective in IOM, but to me it's questionable whether they will be, if they're in the role as it's been conceived in the UK, of being a case manager. So a person who's responsible for, among other things, the rehabilitation of that offender or that support on the assistance pathway. In fact, I've come to think that the optimal role is a bit the way the integrated safety response for family violence operates in New Zealand, where once the police have picked someone up or been called out, they're simply handing over the person or the case to the relevant agencies, and they then continue with their regular job, or they get involved when the agencies need help. They don't continue to be an active part of the rehabilitation or care of that particular whānau or individual. Why would I say that? Well, because I think that the carrot and stick approach can go very wrong. So one of the things that we see in the way that IOM has been done in Britain is that there's a combination of these supportive, helpful things with some very intrusive surveillance. So you can see here described again, for high priority offenders, the enforcement strategies can be tremendously invasive. Daily reviews, regular, singular and multi-agency intelligence visits, CCTV surveillance, covert and overt directed surveillance, financial investigations, ASPOs and arrest, where offenders are failing to adhere to prison licence conditions. So this is actually, as I say, this is a pretty heavy-handed monitoring approach. And the idea, I guess, here is that you could stop people from offending by keeping an incredibly close eye on them. But we know that when control comes under the, from without, it actually disincentivises people to take control of themselves. And also they can be so caught up in these intrusive monitoring practices that it's difficult for them to do simple things like go and look for employment or even do employment, and it can feel very like harassment. And with respect to the licence violation issues, in New Zealand at least, probation officers have quite a bit of discretion about whether they report to police the violation of the parole licence. And that's because a lot of these violations are simply things like when the person doesn't report because they don't have transport or they forgot. And there's really little point in cluttering up prisons with people for things like that. But of course, in the US, this role of integrating police with probation officers has gone very well because probation officers are practically police anyway. They're very much indistinguishable, and that's very much the case that their role is about surveillance. So often parole officers in US jurisdictions are really trying to harass the person into doing something wrong or catch them out doing something wrong with surprise visits and so on. And then they can return them to prison where I think they probably assume they belong. And so we know that in that context, being a parole officer actually increases the risk of recidivism. And that seems a bit unnecessary, really, because quite a lot of the crime we're often talking about that people do after prison in these long-term assistance challenges is often quite minor. And given that fully 75% of crime is never reported to police, at least in New Zealand, you'd have to argue that society seems to be capable of tolerating quite a bit of minor crime before we need to spend over $100,000 a year locking people up for it. And actually, the things that people do to violate licences are often not even crimes in the normal sense. So research looking at compliance, looking at parole supervision, has shown that when parole officers are in that kind of police role, where they're overly attending to surveillance and tracking, then they increase the risk of recidivism. But when parole is a more positive venture, and it includes a strong rehabilitative, supportive, problem-solving component, then the more intensive it is, the more likely it is to reduce recidivism. In compliance, only recidivism typically isn't effective or is less effective. So coming back, excuse me, to these core correctional practice skills, what we're really talking about at the core of all of this, as I said before, is the issue of relationship skills and how well police officers might be able to develop the kind of relationship in the offender manager role to help support long-term persistence, because it requires that they cultivate honest, warm and positive relationships with those they're working with, using plenty of praise and minimal disapproval and other forms of punishment. And I think that's a difficult role, given the core business of police. And while I was reflecting on this, and I hope my police officer friends continue to speak to me about this, but I was brought to mind the Russian myth from early last century of the scorpion and the frog. And for those of you who don't quite remember what that's about, simply speaking, a scorpion wants to cross a river but can't swim, so it asks a frog to carry it across. The frog hesitates, afraid that the scorpion might sting it, quite a reasonable thing. Scorpion argues, though, that if it did that, they would both drown, which also seems quite reasonable, so the frog considers this argument sensible and agrees to transport the scorpion. So the scorpion climbs on board and the frog starts to swim, and then about halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog anyway, dooming them both. The dying frog asks the scorpion why it stung, despite knowing the consequences, to which the scorpion famously replies, "I couldn't help it, it's in my nature." And why I'm really reminded of this myth is not because I think police officers are scorpions or that offenders are frogs, but that whereas probation officers and other service providers tend to be able to have a human service orientation first, it is the nature of police to collect intelligence and use it to detect and capture people, and we need them to do that. So how far can we really push the police officer role to be something else? Although the role has changed over time and police are doing a lot of other things, at the core, we still want them to be police officers. And we can see how problematic it can be when we start to push these other more rehabilitative roles on police. So this participant, a UK police officer in a case manager role, says, "I wouldn't have any problem going and arresting them." And again, that can be a positive thing, because if you arrest them and deal with them fairly and squarely, then they know they've done wrong and you can turn it around. And so you can actually use regular police work in a way that's quite positive for the offender, but it isn't a given unless the roles are well defined. So for example, this person said, "I think there are some offender managers that are very much, their main focus would be on support, and there would be other offender managers whose main focus would be on catch and convict, and then there's those who are in the middle trying to do both." And my question there is, which police officer is a particular offender getting? How do they know which they've got until it's too late? So offenders in the British IOM have described engaging with police officers as offender managers as being very challenging, particularly sometimes working with police officers who've arrested them previously. But when it goes well, it did influence their perceptions of police, leading to more positive views of the organisation and more trust. But that isn't a given, because in many ways the roles are inherently incompatible. And so here another police officer says, "Probation and drug treatment partnerships are very offender focused and don't think very much of the victims out there, whereas the police are very victim focused. So there can be a little bit of a clash sometimes. They'll say things like, 'Don't worry about this, we'll give them a warning for this,' and stuff like that. And actually, no, we're paid by the public and we're there to protect the public, and we're very victim focused." And all of this can lead to some really abuse and misuse of trust situations. So in Cram's research, what came across clearly during the fieldwork with police was that in practice, most police in this role of case or offender manager were using their rehabilitative mandate to generate fresh intelligence. And so some of them said things like, "I like meeting people anyway, get a buzz from going into someone's house and talking to them and being able to look around without being there, just having just kicked the door and so on." And this can lead to stalking horse incidents where people are actually taking advantage of probation officers' powers to break their way into houses when they wouldn't otherwise be allowed in. And it can also corrupt probation officers. So what does this all have to do with police and legitimacy, you might wonder? Well, in New Zealand, 70% of adults actually have no crime experiences in the previous 12 months, whereas something like 25% of crimes reported to police. So we can reasonably assume that most people will not have seen a police officer directly in a given year. So we're not actually so worried about these people in this talk, because although they're an important part of legitimacy and trust, they're not an important part in terms of understanding how we can better keep offenders engaged. So I was thinking about Tyler's process model here, because I think it has more to say about it's more relevant for offenders really, because it talks about people who have direct contact, not just about people who never have contact with the criminal justice system over a period of months. And so according to Tyler's process model, respect and authority comes both from their personal experiences and also from a more general evaluation. And this can lead to people regulating themselves. So, can police get people who are dealing with them to comply in the short and long term? In New Zealand, most people think that police behave fairly and trust them, but it is lower for Māori and Pacifica in general, and it's also less likely that Māori will call the police, and Māori are actually more victimised, often by their own people. So they're a particularly difficult group for police to pursue legitimacy with, and this has not been helped, as Julia Whaipouri has said, by the use of the armed response teams in recent years. Why do offenders have negative attitudes and beliefs about law enforcement? Well, duh. I mean, who likes being arrested, right? But it's also their own mistreatment in their histories. They've been provoked into offending by police at times. They've had racism experiences. They've experienced excessive use of force. Their childhoods haven't taught them how to respect authority, and they're often living in communities where there's a lack of trust. So can legitimacy be regained? Can police actually do anything through their own actions? And I think they can, because prison officers can. So if prison research can support legitimacy, and it can, then so can police. And in fact, there is police research showing that with offenders, both legitimacy can be enhanced, and the key thing here is through procedural justice, but also that procedurally just behaviour by police can predict reductions in recidivism. And it's essentially through this relation bond mechanism that Professor Tom Tyler has talked about. So we're back again to relationships as being central to gaining the trust and legitimacy of police. So just to wrap it up, systems that focus on coming together to provide better integrated services that support assistance and high-risk, high-needs people are a great idea, and police are an important part of these systems, but their success depends on more resources and possibly diverting resources from criminal justice, although I wouldn't hold your breath about that, because a recent investment of something like $2 million and $1 billion in New Zealand resulted in only 5 acute beds. So I don't think police are going to stop dealing with the mental distress episodes anytime soon. I think police best roles in these systems are as police, so this is me as a pretty committed knitter, saying to police that we have plenty of other people who can do these rehab roles, and police should be the best police they can be, because we need police to do that.
Devon, we may try and summarise if we can, if get to the final.
This is the summary here. Okay. Can I just finish this slide?
Yep.
Police will make a more effective contribution to multi-agency offender management by increasing their procedural justice-related behaviour, because that will reduce reoffending as well, and it will increase their legitimacy. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā hui hui tātou katoa.